Now we're coming to the third part of our Module 7, in which we talk about the patterns of Old Testament history. And here we look at the prophets. And the prophets run generally from Isaiah through Malachi. And they cover a period that coheres to a large degree with the monarchy, but in many ways is between Exodus and exile. This is number 7, letter C of our course, exile and return. Now, between the Exodus and the exile, there are a number of minor events that in many ways remind us of the Exodus story. In Judges, this happened many, many times, as you remember, more than a dozen times in the book of Judges. You had many reenactments of the Exodus, of times when Israel was unfaithful, when God allowed enemies to oppress them. The Egypt situation was restored, but then when they cry out to God, God sends a judge like Moses, and that judge revisits the people and brings them back to God and so forth. This has happened a lot in the book of Judges, the experiences of Saul with the Philistines, Rehoboam with the Egyptians, Israel, northern Israel with Syria and Assyria, and Judah with Israel, Moab, Ammon, Assyria, Babylon, many different enemies there. So you see in the experience of the Israelite nation with surrounding nations, you have a reenactment in many ways of the Exodus story over and over again. Repeatedly, God is faithful to his covenant, but the people are unfaithful. And you say, how can God be faithful to the covenant when he lets bad things happen to his people? Well, that's the interesting piece. God is being faithful according to the covenant, regardless of which way he's acting, because he's acting in harmony with the covenant. And we'll see more about that when we get to Module 9. So, in the covenant it says, if you behave this way, here are the consequences. If you behave that way, here are the consequences. If Israel disobeyed God, and yet God intervened to save them, he would, in a sense, be acting out of character. That the covenant itself spells out how God is going to respond to each situation. And God is consistent in how he responds. When Israel is faithful, the response is a positive one. When Israel is unfaithful, the response is negative but predictable. So over and over, God is faithful to his covenant, whether he's blessing his people or cursing his people. And the people are pretty consistently unfaithful. So you have this pattern in the Old Testament, faithfulness and unfaithfulness, God in relation to his people. Now, as you enter into the prophets, and one thing we're going to do is we'll look at the prophets in a sort of chronological order. You have prophets that come before the exile, and then you have prophets that are during the exile, and then you have prophets that are after the exile. So these minor prophets and major prophets are kind of lined up in that way. Before the exile, you have prophets like Isaiah, and to some degree Jeremiah, Hosea, Amos, Obadiah, probably Joel. So you have a number of these prophets are before the exile. Then during the exile, you have Ezekiel, Daniel, in particular. Part of Jeremiah certainly is during the exile. And then after the exile, you have Malachi, you have Zechariah, you have Haggai. These are the post-exilic prophets. But what is clear throughout this period is that the focus is on the exile above all else. The exile looms over everything in the prophets. The pre-exilic prophets, like Hosea and Amos, they are prophesying what will happen when the exile comes. Those who are in it, like Daniel and Ezekiel, are talking about where God is at within the exile. And then the post-exilic prophets kind of look back and reflect on what has occurred, and they ponder the implications for that time and place. You see, under David and Solomon and Saul, particularly David and Solomon, Israel was united in a single nation. Israel actually became fairly powerful, fairly prosperous. Under David and Solomon, it extended its borders to the very edge of Egypt and Assyria. So Israel conquered many surrounding nations, was quite a powerful nation. Now, historically, because Egypt and Assyria, Babylon are much bigger entities, Egypt and Assyria, Babylon are much bigger entities than Israel, it's natural that they would be superpowers and that they would normally dominate the scene. But there were a couple of times when Egypt and Assyria were weaker than usual. And during those times, Israel had the opportunity to gain a little bit of free space and actually expand their borders at times. One of these was under David and Solomon, and another was under the time of Hezekiah and Uzzah in the south, and Jeroboam II in the north. And perhaps going back all the way to Ahab, there was a period of relative prosperity and relative military and political success. So Israel is kind of a buffer state between superpowers, and thus is always trying to navigate its way in that kind of political situation. Now, since the main focus of the prophets is the exile to Babylon, what language do they use to describe the exile to Babylon? And the reality is that language is the language of the Exodus. The Exodus is the model for what God will do when Babylon comes along. The exile to Babylon reminds of the slavery in Egypt. The return from Babylon reminds of the Exodus story. And so in these prophets, the exile to Babylon is consistently being described in the language of the Exodus. The exile pictured in terms of the Exodus. So for the prophets, when Israel goes to Babylon, God is going to repeat the Exodus all over again. And you can see the mercy of God in giving them clarity about the future that is coming, so that they won't be completely discouraged as to what God is doing. So let's begin with Hosea. And Hosea may be as early as 760 BC. And Hosea comes at the time when Israel and Judah are at the very height of their power and prosperity. The king in northern Israel, and as you're probably aware, after Solomon, Israel divided into northern and southern kingdom. The southern kingdom was primarily Judah, but also had elements of Simeon and Levi and perhaps a bit of Benjamin as well. And so that's the southern kingdom. And then you have the northern kingdom, often called the 10 tribes. And those are the tribes that live to the north. And in many ways, the environment was a bit different in those places. And they naturally tended to gravitate to a slightly different track than Judah. But during the time of Hosea, both northern and southern kingdoms were quite prosperous and were at the widest extent that they were at during this dual monarchy period. Hosea, he is going to the northern kingdom, and if I'm not mistaken, Amos focuses more on the southern kingdom. Anyway, a crucial text that I want you to focus on is Hosea 2 in verses 8 through 15. And what I'm going to be doing in this lecture is not looking at all the texts that we could look at, but simply some selected sample texts. And I'm not going to take the time to read those texts. I'm going to ask you to stop the video, read those texts before we discuss each one of them in order to save a bit of time. Hosea chapter 2, verses 8 to 15 is God speaking to Israel, and he's talking about their prosperity. Things are going real well. The crops are coming in, and of course in an agricultural society, if you have a surplus of crops, you can trade them or sell them and make money on that. And so when there's abundance of food, not only are people healthy and happy, but they often can be more prosperous as well, can buy some of the material things of this world. So here's the picture. Israel is prosperous. Jeroboam II reaping some of the positive consequences of the reforms that occurred after Ahab. And but by now people are forgetting Yahweh once again. And so he says, I gave you wine, grain, oil, bread, all the good things of life, and you acted as if you had done it yourself or if some other gods had done it for you. And so what God proposes is he wants to bring Israel back to himself. And there's an interesting way that this is described. In chapter 2 of Hosea, and please stop the video for a moment and go back to verse 8 and read this whole section, 8 through 15, and then we'll focus in on 14 and 15. Verse 14, therefore I am now going to allure her. I will lead her into the desert and speak tenderly to her. Now this leading into the desert, does that remind you of anything? When earlier did God lead Israel into the desert? The Exodus. So here the Exodus is in mind. Hosea is looking into the future. He's recognizing, as God is speaking here, he's recognizing that Israel is not within God's grace right now. It's not within his favor. But that God at a future time will redo the Exodus. And that when he redoes the Exodus, Israel will return to him. And it was in the wilderness that God and Israel developed their relationship. Verse 15, there I will give her back her vineyards, and will make the valley of Achor a door of hope. Then she will sing as in the days of her youth, as in the day when she came up out of Egypt. The main focus of all the prophets is the exile. Israel would go away from their land, would go to Babylon. Some talk about 70 years, some don't mention it. But they're looking forward to a time when Israel will go into captivity, but that God has a positive purpose in that captivity, in that it will bring them back to him. So the exile is clearly pictured in terms of the Exodus. Israel is the wife of God. She's become unfaithful in the context of Hosea, and so God intends to divorce her, but he will not do so forever. Instead, he will take her back. He'll renew his courtship. He'll take her to the place where they fell in love the first time. You know, counselors say it's not a bad thing if you want to restore a marriage. Go to some of the places that you went to when you were dating. Review some of those early scenes. Remember the early affections that you had for each other. And in that process, you will restore a relationship that was broken and lost. So God's plan is a new wilderness experience, and that is the exile in Babylon. Did they literally go into the wilderness? Not really. The actual path of the captivity was probably along the Fertile Crescent all the way around. But the wilderness becomes a metaphor of the place where God originally fell in love with Israel. And that metaphor of spiritual return to God is grounded in the literal terms of the Exodus. So we come to the spiritualizing of the type here. that the literal actions of the Exodus now are more and more seen as spiritual realities in the return from Babylon. Let's turn to Micah, who was a Judean contemporary of Hosea. And I'd like you to turn to Micah chapter 7, verses 15 and through 20. Micah 7, verses 15 to 20. Please pause the video and read those verses carefully, and then I'll talk about them briefly. Once again here, the language is clearly the language of a new Exodus. You have abundant language here which reminds of Exodus 14, Exodus 15. But notice particularly the special thing about this, the spiritualizing of the type. Here the Exodus story becomes a lesson of what God will do spiritually for them in the exile. You have all the language of Egyptians drowning in the sea, of the sea saving the Israelites from their enemies. And it talks about them going down in the depths of the sea. And then it talks about God forgiving their sins. And God will take their sins and put them at the bottom of the sea. The importance of the Exodus story for the Israelites is that the Egyptians who were persecuting them went down into the sea, and what went down there didn't come back up. They did not return. And so God is saying, likewise, when I restore my relationship with you, when you go to Babylon, I will put your sins down at the bottom of the sea. What goes down to the bottom of the sea doesn't come back up. And so God takes the Exodus story, applies it to the exile, but now applies it in a spiritual context, a recognition that the primary purpose of the Exodus is not simply the literal return of Israel, but a restoration of God's covenant relationship with Israel. We'll turn now to Isaiah, one of the so-called major prophets because of the length of his writings. And in Isaiah chapter 11, verses 15 to 16. And I think I'll read that with you because that is so significant to our theme here. Isaiah chapter 11 and verses 15 and 16. Encourage you to look along. Isaiah 11, 15 and 16. The Lord will dry up the gulf of the Egyptian sea. With a scorching wind he will sweep his hand over the Euphrates River. What's happening here? You have here, first of all, a drying up of the Egyptian sea. That's the Exodus story. The Red Sea dried up so that the Israelites could walk across. That's using the very specific Hebrew language of that earlier event. So the Lord, with a scorching wind, he'll sweep his hand over the Euphrates River. Wait a minute. What's the Euphrates River got to do with this? I thought we were in the Egyptian Sea. Well, it's the language of the Exodus. The language of the Egyptian Sea. That's a model for what God will do in Babylon, where the waters are not the Red Sea, but are the Euphrates River. And the importance here is not simply some kind of literal back and forth, but what God is saying is, look, when the exile to Babylon comes, I will work for you in the way that I worked for Israel back in the time of the Exodus. Notice verse 16. With a scorching wind, he'll sweep his hand over the Euphrates River. He will break it up into 7 streams so that men can cross over in sandals. There will be a highway for the remnant of his people that is left from Assyria, as there was for Israel when they came up out of Egypt. So here you see in explicit terms the parallel and the contrast, that the exile to Babylon and the return is modeled on the Exodus. But at the same time, there are differences. In the Exodus story, a literal wind blew across the sea, dried up the sea, created an opening for God's people to cross. Did that happen in Babylon? Not exactly. There is no wind actually described, but rather Cyrus and his engineers diverted the river Euphrates, thereby drying it up, allowing Cyrus's army to march through the gates of the city to the dry riverbed. So the details of the fulfillment are not identical to the Exodus. But do you remember back in the first lecture of this module, what did we discover? God is consistent. There's going to be a pattern. In each case, you have some water involved. In each case, there's a drying up. In each case, somebody is marching across that dry, watery bed. But there's also differences. The drying up of the river Euphrates doesn't allow the Israelites to cross. After all, they can cross on the bridges. They just don't have permission to cross. But the drying up of the river and the dry seabed allows their deliverance. So the Exodus is the model. But if you remember that God is not predictable and that He's also creative, you don't take the model and assume you fully understand the outcome on the basis of the model. God is not that literal. God is not that wooden-headed that He goes from the one and says, okay, I'm going to do this exactly all over again. It's going to be identical. There's going to be no difference between the two. No, God responds in each situation creatively and unpredictably, even though there is clearly a pattern. So in Isaiah 4, verses 2 to 6, I would encourage you to take a moment to read that text and then come back to the video. And in Isaiah chapter 4, we see abundant references to the Exodus, particularly the cloud, the pillar of cloud by day and by night. Pillar of cloud, pillar of fire, and so forth. You see abundant references to that here in Isaiah 4. So Isaiah 4 is talking about God's restoration after the exile, but he's using the language of the Exodus. There's no biblical text that tells us that there was a similar cloud of, by day or fire by night. Nothing exactly like the Exodus seems to have occurred in Babylon. At least we don't know of it from Scripture. But what is clear again is the Exodus becomes the pattern for the exile. God uses the language of the Exodus to predict the future, to show the Israelites where things are going in the future. And when you're using the past as a pattern for the future, not every detail of the pattern is likely to be fulfilled. Another text I'd like you to look at, Isaiah 43, verses 16 to 19. And I'd appreciate if you read that text before you listen to the following. In Isaiah 43, it's very, very interesting because in verses 16 and 17, you clearly have the Exodus model again. You look at that language, it sounds just like Exodus 15. But while the Exodus provides the model, verses 18 and 19 tell us that the exile itself will be a new thing. God will do a new thing. The past provides the language of the future, but the future actually transcends the past. It goes beyond the language of the past. And the reality, of course, is we can't understand anything except in terms of our past. We all, our language, our whole understanding is grounded in our past experience as children, as teenagers, as adults, and so forth. So the entire past experience of Israel becomes material from which God can draw language to describe what the future will be like. Clearly that's occurring in the Messianic prophecies, where it says that the Messiah will be a prophet like Moses, a king like David, a priest like Aaron or Melchizedek. God is using the language of the past. He's using language and models that they're familiar with to describe what he will do in the future. Is Jesus exactly like Moses or David? No. In many ways he is not. But these characters provide models, if you will, by which God describes the future. Now take Isaiah 65 and read verses 17 through 19, if you would. Just pause the video and do that, please. What it says is that the return from Babylon will be so great, so marvelous, that the Exodus isn't big enough for that. When God brings them back from Babylon, he's going to do an action even bigger than the Exodus. And if it's bigger than the Exodus, then he's got to go all the way back to creation to find language that is in any way adequate to portray what is taking place in the return from exile in Babylon. So Isaiah looks forward to what God is going to do with his people at the return from Babylon, but he does so with superlative language and says this will be a new creation. God's going to start all over, and he's going to do amazing things. Now you might ask yourself the question, we see in the prophets this idea of a pattern between past and future. God using the language of the past to describe the future. God sort of meeting each person in their own historical context. And some people would say, well, that probably works for the classical prophets. I imagine that works for Isaiah and Jeremiah and Hosea and so forth. But what about apocalyptic? I mean, apocalyptic seems like a completely different kind of thing. In apocalyptic, God seems to choose symbols that aren't always historical, that aren't always reality. I mean, when have you last seen an animal with 7 heads and 10 horns? If you've seen any lately, you've probably been drinking. But the reality is such creatures don't exist except in the human imagination. And apocalyptic often draws on that human imagination. However, apocalyptic also has a sense of building on the past. And I think of Daniel 7. In Daniel 2, God gives Nebuchadnezzar a vision of the future, and he describes that future in terms of an idol. Here's this idol with different colored metals. And through that, Nebuchadnezzar sees a pattern of what God will do in the future. Well, when God comes to Daniel in chapter 7, he gives the same essential content. Once again, there's 4 kingdoms followed by the kingdom of God. But in Daniel 7, it's all about creation. Take a look at Daniel 7. Just pause the video and look at Daniel 7, verses 2 and 3, and verses 13 and 14, I would suggest. And then we'll talk about it for a bit. What you see in the background of Daniel 7 is God meeting Daniel where he is. Just as he met Nebuchadnezzar where he was, showed him the future in the form of an idol, God shows Daniel the future in the form of creation. You have a stormy sea, you have the wind blowing over the waters, just as occurred in Genesis 1, verse 2. And then after the wind appears, you have animals appearing, just as in the original creation. And then in verse 13 and 14, you have a son of man, a human figure, who has dominion over the nations. Now, if the animals of Daniel 7 represent the nations, then who is this son of man who has dominion over the nations? That would be Adam. In other words, the Daniel 7 story is the story of a new Adam, the story of a new creation, in which God will restore the dominion that the human race had lost. So in Daniel chapter 7, we are not simply dealing with apocalyptic imagination, but we're also dealing with a serious and significant look at history. The message to Daniel is that your people are being oppressed by these wicked nations. However, when my Son of Man comes, he will have dominion over these nations just as Adam had dominion over the animals in the Garden of Eden. Can you see the expansion of the original parallel, the spiritualization, if you wish, of the type? The animals become a metaphor of the nations. And just as Adam controlled the animals in the Garden of Eden, so God is controlling the affairs of the nations. So as the prophets, the pre-exilic prophets, look forward to the exile and the return, they see a great, mighty act of God. It's an act as big as the Exodus. In fact, it's bigger than the Exodus. It is totally huge. It's amazing, and they will marvel at what God will do. But then comes the reality. After the exile, you see what actually happened. It's quite a disappointment. Instead of millions returning, you have about 50,000. Instead of miracles and grand things like the Exodus, pillar of fire and parting the sea and walking across on dry land and water flowing from the rock and manna falling from heaven and so on. I mean, it's one miracle after another in the Exodus. When the return from exile comes, none of that. Just a lot of hard work. Got to build the houses, got to build a temple, got to build a city, and there's enemies and there's opposition all the way through, there's persecution. So the promise and the reality, as you draw to the close, they're rather disappointing, discouraging. And it becomes increasingly clear as we draw to the close of the Old Testament, and now listen to me very carefully. It becomes increasingly clear that the greatest and the mightiest act of God is still future. The greatest Exodus is still future. The Old Testament doesn't end with a bang, it ends with a whimper. It's incomplete. If Haggai and Zechariah are the fulfillment, then it's a great disappointment. Take a moment right now and look at Haggai chapter 2. It's a small book right toward the end of the Old Testament. Haggai chapter 2 and verses 1 to 9. Just read that for a moment and then I'll continue. So when you've read that section, you realize that they're really disappointed. They were expecting a new temple to be enormous, to be spectacular. Ezekiel, after all, had prophesied just such a gigantic temple. But then, here they are looking at the actual temple, and it's just like a miserable shack compared to their expectations. They are disappointed. They say, could this possibly be what the prophets were talking about? And the answer of the Lord through Haggai is yes, this is what I said was going to happen. This is the fulfillment that I asked you to look for. In other words, sometimes the fulfillments of God within history are a disappointment. They don't seem to quite live up to the language that the prophets used to express it. But we get some understanding of this when we remember the principle of spiritualization of the type. That the further you get along in the Bible, the more spiritualization takes place. And you see a literal historical event, and then in the fulfillment you see something less visible, less political, less national, and much more spiritual. Haggai 2. How will this latter house be greater than the former one? Because Yahweh himself will visit that house in the person of Jesus. When the desire of all nations will come, then the latter house will be greater. It won't be greater in style. than Solomon's temple. It won't be greater in size necessarily. It won't be greater in any of the ways that human beings count greatness. But it will be greater in the spiritual sense, in that there will be a human being walking on this earth who is genuinely following God, who is genuinely in covenant relationship with God, who is obedient as Israel was supposed to be obedient. This Messiah figure will be the king that is truly faithful, will be what Israel was truly intended to be. And because of that, this latter temple will be greater than the former temple. That the Shekinah glory of God will return to the temple housed in the body of a human being. Zechariah 9, verses 9 and 10. Take a moment and read that text as well. When you finish that text, can you really blame the Jews for thinking the Messiah might be a little more spectacular than Jesus actually was? You see, when the Old Testament talks about Messiah, it talks about a king like David, a king who would conquer all the enemies, who would bring peace on every side. And Solomon, his very name, means peace. So with the spiritualizing of the type, however, the fulfillment tends to come more to the eyes of faith than to the eyes of reality. The return from exile wasn't nearly as spectacular as the Exodus in terms of political realities. But in terms of the spiritual outcome, the arrival of Jesus is the climax. In fact, Jesus becomes, for the New Testament, the single great mighty act of God. Remember I said to you, the disappointments of the return from the exile bring to the people the conviction that the greatest, mightiest act of God is yet future. And that is what the New Testament is all about. You see, we've done this survey of the Old Testament to make it clear that in a real sense, the New Testament is necessary in order to complete the Old. The Old Testament's an unfinished book. It's an incomplete book. It ends with a whimper rather than with a bang. But when we come to the end of the Old Testament, we are pointed forward to something bigger that is yet to come. And according to the New Testament, that bigger thing is Jesus Christ. Something outside of the Old Testament is necessary to complete it. After all, there had to be the conviction that this wasn't the best that God could do. And that's definitely the impression that you get from the close of the Old Testament. This couldn't possibly be the best that God could do. This couldn't be the blessing for all the nations that God promised to Abraham. This couldn't be the spectacular new Exodus that God had in mind. This couldn't possibly be the new creation that totally transforms everything. The Old Testament is unfinished and incomplete. And I believe that the New Testament is the natural heir of the Old. We will see as we move into Module 8 how the New Testament draws on the characters, the stories, the people, the places of the Old Testament, and draws from them spiritual analogies and applies them in Jesus Christ. As we close this lecture, I want to make a couple of points. You've kind of heard the conclusion, but let me just share a couple of other things that I think we need to point out at this time in order to be ready for Module 8, which is soon to come. One of these is the fact that there's a lot of this typology that the New Testament uses already going on inside the Old Testament. In other words, within the Old Testament, you see prophets taking earlier events, using them as models for what God is doing right now or what God will do in the future. You saw Daniel 7, how the creation story becomes a model for this vision of the nations to come. You've seen the Exodus and how it built on the creation for example. So this typological idea is really the hermeneutical root for how the New Testament functions. The New Testament reads the Old Testament in the way that the Old Testament read itself. A couple of examples of this would be Joshua and Josiah, both of which are clearly described as new Moses figures. Now I'd like you to pause at this moment and go back to Module 7, and there you will see a document, and let me see if I can come up with, I have a picture of Module 7 here, and the name of that document I am not seeing. But let me tell you what it is about, and I will certainly go back and make sure that that is there by the time you see this video. But the document I have in mind is a document about typologies within the Old Testament itself. That you have typology of Joshua. He is described as a new Moses. He follows the pattern of Moses. Josiah is a new Moses, and he follows that pattern. He's described in the language of how Moses functioned. So you see figures coming along that are modeled on earlier figures. This is not something that Western scholars are making up when they come to this material, but it's rather comes from careful comparison of the Hebrew text between these characters. And one evidence for that is Hezekiah. In many ways, Hezekiah is a reformer. He restores the law of Moses. He restores obedience to the covenant and so forth. So you could argue that Hezekiah is a new Moses, that he plays a Moses-like role within the context of the Old Testament. But the language of Moses is not applied to Hezekiah. The handout, the PDF handout that should be there on your website will help explain that, how typology works within the Old Testament itself. So if you take a look at that document, that will help prepare you for module number 8. When we take a look at Jesus as the ultimate fulfillment of Old Testament history, it will begin to make sense when you see how Hebrews connected these things. One other thing that I'd like to mention is that as we worked through Module 7, we made frequent reference to the fact that the three relationships at creation become a model for repeated promises of God later on. The three relationships of the creation are the focus of the fall and the breaking of those relationships. But then the three promises to Abraham, they restore the three relationships that were broken. You have a promise related to God. You have a promise related to stewardship over the earth. You have a promise related to how human beings relate to each other. And we saw that particularly in 7a, the part on the Pentateuch. The interesting thing is when you get to the prophets make sense when you realize it's all about the exile. And the exile modeled on the Exodus. The exile is also modeled on Abraham in this sense. You go to Ezekiel 36. You go to Isaiah 11. You go to Micah 4 and other prophetic passages. And they're all modeled on these three relationships. Ezekiel 36, verses 22 to 38, and you probably should pause the video and read that before you hear what follows. But in Ezekiel 36, verses 27 to 29 and verse 31, God talks about the new heart that he will give to the Israelites at the return from Babylon. He will restore his relationship with them, the covenant relationship, the blessing. But then he also talks in verse 24 and 33 about gathering the people from all the places that they have come. In other words, that multitude, that nation, that the children of Abraham are going to be gathered back together and be together once again. And then in verses 22 and 29 and 30, there's an emphasis on the land of Canaan. He will return them to their land. So he will restore the land, he'll restore the nation and the kingship, and he will restore a relationship with God. That's the three promises to Abraham. That's the three relationships of creation. You see this over and over again in the prophets. So if you want to make sense of the prophets, you keep in mind the Exodus is always in view, that, the exile, that it's modeled on the Exodus and on creation. So that's where understanding the language can be helpful. And keep in mind that the focus is on a restoration of the three relationships that go all the way back to Eden. So there's a consistency throughout the Old Testament. And as I said, if you look at Micah 4, 1 to 8, or Isaiah 11, 1 to 16, you will see these three once again. And you'll see them over and over as you go all the way through the Old Testament. Well, this brings to a conclusion the lectures for Module 7. You'll be relieved to know that. It brings to a conclusion our look at the patterns of Old Testament history. And now we come for what many students in the past have felt is the climax of this course, and that is Module number 8. And in Module number 8, we will focus in particular on how Jesus is the fulfillment of the whole life and history of the Old Testament. So we'll see you again when you're ready for that.